versus cultural, social, and legal issues in other societies. What is freedom of expression? Freedom of expression is a fundamental human right. By definition, it refers to the ability of an individual or group of individuals to express their beliefs, thoughts, ideas, and emotions about different issues free from government censorship. Why is it so important? Well, organizations like UNESCO and the United Nations support the belief that it is a fundamental human right. Freedom of expression reinforces all other human rights, allowing society to develop and progress. The ability to express our opinion and speak freely is essential to bringing about change in society. Free speech is important for this reason and many others. Free expression and the internet. The way the internet is used is extremely different in every nation. When discussing the internet and freedom of expression, the fact that every society is unique has to be taken into account. Usually, all of the laws have a deeper meaning and have a connection to culture, society, and politics in each respective nation. Sometimes what is perceived as taboo or unusual to others might be completely fine and acceptable in a certain country, and what is done in other countries might seem taboo to them. One of the main topics when it comes to free expression on the internet is accessibility and censorship, as nations can essentially place a limit on how widespread they want the internet to be or what specific topics or websites they want to censor. Totalitarian dictatorships seem to be the ones infringing on internet freedom the most. Nations like China, Cuba, North Korea, etc. are notorious for their crackdowns on the internet. But that does not necessarily mean that infringement of expression does not happen in democracies as well. In this presentation, we'll be mostly discussing Cuba and its unique situation as the most censored country in the Western Hemisphere. How totalitarianism kills free expression. Cuba. First, we must understand Cuba's internet accessibility situation. Internet speeds lag behind regional averages and access is extremely restricted due to limited infrastructure, high prices, low speed, and Cuban government-regulated access points. Only about 2% of homes in Cuba benefit from dial-up internet connection, so they must resort to public access points in parks and popular areas and pay for scratch-off access code cards sold in specific kiosks. Many Cubans are now able to connect to the internet through their cell phones, a service that only became available in December 2018. The mobile network uses outdated 2G and 3G technology and lacks sufficient bandwidth, which results in very slow speeds and a nearly unusable internet. Only 47% of the population has 3G coverage. These mobile data plans are also very difficult to access, as they can cost up to $30 United States dollars for 4 gigabytes. Taking into account that the average monthly salary in Cuba is around 30 United States dollars, it is nearly impossible for most Cubans to have internet access on their smartphones without help from family members who live outside of the island and send them remittances. They must basically choose between buying daily necessities or connecting to the internet, which seems like a very easy choice to make. Also, in Cuba there is only a singular internet provider, the state-owned internet and telecommunications monopoly ETEXA, which has the power and capability to throttle internet speeds, restrict access, and censor specific topics at will. This has essentially forced Cubans to engineer a very underground version of the internet, connecting Ethernet cables from house to house all over Havana and in other cities across the small island nation. It's known as the Street Network, or SNET, which is basically used to do very basic things such as playing video games with others, downloading and sharing media like music and software smuggled into the island. Although this has also been intercepted by the government-controlled Youth Computer Club, eroding some of the freedoms it had when it was more clandestine. Cuban journalists fight back and the regime reacts. After many years of suppression, Cuban independent journalists have found a voice on the internet. Using social media platforms such as YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, and multiple internet blog sites, they have been able to spread their thoughts and criticize the regime's injustices. As more and more Cubans within the island sign up for these sites, they are beginning to see life outside of Cuba and get to decide for themselves if the regime's propaganda is convincing enough. One of these sites, called El Estornudo, or The Sneeze in English, was very popular with Cubans inside the island and with exiles no longer living on the island. The site allowed journalists from both inside Cuba and outside to speak their minds on the country's situation through critical essays and feature articles. Because El Estornudo is hosted in Australia and counts among its contributors Cubans on the islands, along with Cubans who now live in the US, Spain, and other countries, it has now joined the ranks of media outlets and websites in the country that have been temporarily censored by state authorities, in an ongoing effort to limit what information Cubans can access on the internet. In response to these sites, the regime has come out with a decree to further censor independent journalism on the island. Article 68 of Decree 370 bans, and I quote, hosting a site on servers located in a foreign country and disseminating information contrary to the social interests, morals, good manners, and integrity of people on public networks. Whoever dares to go against this decree would face the confiscation of equipment and media used to commit the violations, and fines equating up to a few hundred US, which puts sites like El Estornudo on the censorship list since they are hosted outside of the island. Nearly all independent journalists on the island work for blogs and news sites which are hosted outside of the island, where in a way they are beyond the reach of the communist government hands. The previously unregulated blogs are now deemed illegal on the island, striking fear in journalists who want to make a living without relying on the government, whilst also being able to report the truth or their opinions on certain key issues that occur in the island. The government now has a legal basis to justify their aggression and detainment of independent bloggers and journalists on the island, and also the censorship of the blogs itself on the island's internet system. Comparison: American democracy versus Cuban totalitarianism. When it comes to the United States, it is touted as a nation with extensive freedom and liberties. This also extends to the internet in the US. Accessibility to the internet in the US is very high. It can be accessed in virtually anywhere and even at no cost at all in public libraries, restaurants, etc. The US government also encourages internet use through government programs in unison with internet service providers to provide internet at home at a lower cost for those who belong to low-income groups. Censorship is also not much of a problem when compared to most countries. Pretty much anything can be searched, discussed, and found on the internet, with the exception of illegal subjects that might not be suitable for the public, and even those things can sometimes be found on the internet if you look hard enough. In comparison to Cuba, we can see how different the government approaches. The US makes it cheap and accessible for their citizens to access the internet, while in Cuba, the average citizen cannot even afford to pay for the slow and outdated internet service. This does not mean that the US is perfect in any way, shape, or form. The US government infringement of freedom on the internet is more related to surveillance and the massive data harvesting done by corporations such as Amazon, Facebook, and Google. For example, immigration and law enforcement agencies increased their use of social media surveillance, in some cases using automated tools that identify people of interest. Researchers also cited a March 2019 NBC News report indicating that border agents had compiled social media and other information on 59 people, mostly American citizens, who were to be stopped for questioning at the border. The government said at the time that the list was part of an investigation into border violence. So that prompts the question: should you limit what you talk about on social media, and who's keeping track? In a way, being afraid that what you say one day on social media can be recorded and used against you is an infringement of freedom of expression. Also, social media sites like Twitter in a way partake in censorship when they control what can and cannot be said on their sites. To what extent should we give Twitter the freedom to put a limit on individuals? Due to cases like these, the Supreme Court ruled that law enforcement must obtain search warrants before getting records from personal cell phones and other information from third parties. Here we see how both governments react to the criticism. In the US, the Supreme Court rules in favor of the people through Carpenter versus USA, while Cuba further implements its crackdown on journalists and passes Decree 370, making it nearly impossible for them to be able to freely express themselves. Ethically, we see that the Cuban regime's reaction is abusive, hurtful, and backwards, and even though the US has its own issues with the infringement of freedom on the internet, we see that they react in favor of its constituents. Conclusions. Essentially, no single nation in the world is exempt of criticism when it comes to freedom of expression and liberty on the internet, especially since the internet is constantly evolving at a very fast rate. But ethically, we can note the differences between totalitarian regimes and other democracies around the world. Cuba's situation is very unique and difficult to understand from the outside. Reading about it is simply not enough. Even after 60 years of repression, the internet nearly brings the small impoverished nation a breath of fresh air, and the government does nearly everything to try to crush it. But they will not be able to do this forever, as the internet plays a larger role worldwide as each day passes by. References: